When it comes to starvation in Biafra and its analysis, much attention has focused on the federal government's blockade and Awolowo's policies. However, within Biafra itself, decisions made by its leader, Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, also shaped the course of the crisis. While Ojukwu became an icon of Biafran resistance, his policies and stubbornness contributed significantly to the starvation of his own people. We tell the full story of how Ojukwu starved Biafra during the Civil War in this episode. Ojukwu was not merely a military commander, he was the embodiment of the Biafran cause. Educated at Oxford and trained as an officer in the Nigerian army, he presented himself as a cultured, eloquent, and determined leader fighting for the survival of his people. His charisma was undeniable, and the species rallied a besieged population. However, his style of leadership also meant that dissent was discouraged and strategic decisions rested heavily on his judgment. One of those judgments concerned the issue of food and relief. As the crisis deepened, Ojukwu framed starvation not simply as a tragedy, but as a political weapon to mobilize international outrage against Nigeria. By turning suffering into propaganda, the Biafran head of state sought to transform weakness into strength, but at a terrible human cost. By late 1967, Nigeria's blockade had effectively cut off Biafra from the outside world. Ports were lost, and only clandestine night flights from Fernando Po could bring in limited supplies of arms and food. The federal government under Yakubu Gowon insisted that relief could only enter Biafra through Nigerian-controlled channels in order to prevent the smuggling of weapons. Ojukwu rejected this outright. He argued that federally supervised food would be poisoned or manipulated, a fear that resonated with a population that had just suffered pogroms in northern Nigeria. His refusal meant that food relief from the International Committee of the Red Cross and other agencies, which could have been distributed in greater quantities, was blocked from reaching starving civilians. While historians have noted that Gowon's blockade created the crisis, Ojukwu's unwillingness to compromise on relief distribution condemned millions to starvation. The clandestine airlift into Biafra became one of the largest humanitarian operations of the 20th century. Church groups organized nightly flights carrying powdered milk, beans, and medicine. However, these flights were also used to smuggle arms for Biafra's war efforts. This dual use blurred the line between relief and military supply. Ojukwu deliberately exploited the crisis to build international sympathy. Images of starving Biafran children were circulated globally, and Biafra's public relations machine, run in parts from Geneva and London, portrayed Nigeria as committing a genocide. While these efforts generated massive donations and political support abroad, they also relied on keeping the crisis in the public eye. Accepting Nigerian supervised relief would have undercut the propaganda. In effect, hunger became a bargaining chip in Ojukwu's diplomatic strategy. The tragic irony was that while Biafra's suffering won international sympathy, the people themselves continued to die in their thousands each day. Relief flights could not keep up with the scale of starvation. Within Biafra itself, Ojukwu's government was accused of mismanaging the limited food that did arrive. Military priorities often took precedence over civilian needs. Soldiers received the first share of relief, while markets in towns saw inflated prices that placed food beyond the reach of ordinary families. Those with money or connections could eat, the poor wasted away. In some cases, relief supplies flown in by church missions were seized by the Biafran government and redirected to its soldiers. Thus, even as Ojukwu appealed to the world about his people's suffering, his administration failed to distribute available food equitably. Starvation was not only the result of blockade, but also of corruption, hoarding, and poor governance within Biafra itself. In 1968 and again in 1969, international negotiators proposed safe corridors for food relief, land routes or neutral zones through which food could be delivered under international supervision. The federal government agreed in principle to such arrangements, but Ojukwu rejected them, insisting on absolute sovereignty for Biafra. Critics argue that this was a fatal miscalculation. By prioritizing political symbolism over human survival, Ojukwu closed the door to potential relief for millions. His refusal to trust any arrangement that passed through Nigerian lines meant that starvation intensified. To Ojukwu, the survival of Biafra as a state was more important than the temporary alleviation of hunger. To his people, however, this meant that the promise of food was continually sacrificed on the altar of politics. Biafra's information campaign was remarkably effective. Journalists who reported from the enclave described the crisis in harrowing terms. International aid groups compared the suffering to the Holocaust, sparking a global humanitarian movement. Ojukwu's government tightly controlled access for journalists and photographers, ensuring that the most shocking images of starving children circulated abroad. The crisis thus became both a reality and a carefully curated narrative used to pressure international opinion. While it is true that Nigeria's blockade set the conditions, Ojukwu's refusal to accept compromises and his manipulation of the crisis narrative meant that starvation was not merely incidental, it was instrumentalized for political ends. The toll of these policies was staggering. By the end of the war in January 1970, between 1 and 2 million people had died in Biafra, most from hunger and preventable disease. Many were children who succumbed to kwashiorkor, their bellies swollen and their eyes lifeless. In his final broadcast before fleeing into exile in January 1970, Ojukwu praised the gallantry and sacrifice of the Biafran people. But for many, this sacrifice had been imposed upon them, not chosen. The historical verdict on Ojukwu is complex. Some view him as a tragic hero who resisted overwhelming odds in defense of his people. Others see him as a stubborn leader whose pride and political ambitions cost millions of lives. While sympathetic to Biafra, Ojukwu was authoritarian and brooked no dissent, even when alternative strategies might have saved lives. His refusal to compromise on relief corridors was a critical factor in the crisis. What is clear is that Ojukwu's policies compounded the effects of the blockade. Nigeria may have created the crisis, but Ojukwu's decisions deepened it. To say that he starved Biafra is to recognize his responsibility in prolonging hunger as a tool of politics and war. The tragedy of Biafra was that starvation became a weapon wielded not only by Nigeria but also by Biafra's own leader. Ojukwu's refusal of relief under federal supervision, his use of crisis as propaganda, and his administration's mismanagement of food supplies meant that millions of his people died unnecessarily. Ojukwu remains a revered figure in some circles, celebrated for his defiance and leadership. However, history must also acknowledge the darker side of his legacy. By elevating political symbolism above human survival, he became complicit in the starvation of Biafra. The children who died of hunger were victims not just of blockade, but of choices made by their own leader.